execution by electrocution. By 1970, the Auburn facility was one of New York State's most overcrowded prisons, thanks in part to the country's war on crime and the aforementioned shifting of prisoners from New York City's jails. The issues in Auburn would really start when some prisoners asked their superintendent for permission to commemorate Black Solidarity Day, a day created in 1969 by activist, historian, and playwright Carlos E. Russell that was meant to be observed every year in November on Monday before Election Day. Black Solidarity Day was supposed to involve a 24-hour moratorium from shopping or any other commercial activity, as a way of highlighting racial inequality and illustrating the impact African American communities have on the economy. The effort to observe this day in Auburn prison was specifically led by members of the Black Panther Party and by members of the Nation of Islam. Their request, though, despite going through the proper channels, received no official response one way or the other. So, on the 2nd of November, a group of Black Muslim prisoners decided to make the decision themselves, as they managed to grab a hold of a microphone in the exercise yard that they then used to announce in honor of Black Solidarity Day, quote, "No black man should work today." At which point 3 to 4 prisoners moved to block the doors leading to the yard, keeping the guards out. As a result, for the next 6 hours, much of Auburn's African-American workforce, instead of going to their prison jobs, remained in the yard, where they listened to speeches. After which, those involved more or less peacefully returned to their cells for the evening head count. Essentially then, all that happened was little more than a 6-hour work stoppage that had been peaceful and largely seemed to have, if anything, released some tension among the prisoners. This was especially true when the rank-and-file guards informed the prisoners that they had no intention of punishing them for their actions. Prison administrators, though, apparently had other plans, and subsequently ordered the 14 men they identified as the leaders of the protest locked into their cells indefinitely. Unsurprisingly, instead of quelling or dissuading future unrest, this only served to upset the prisoners. Indeed, the very morning the 14 were first locked up, 400 prisoners, both black and white, refused to report for work until the 14 were released from their cells. Then, when Auburn's administrators refused to even meet with these men to discuss their demands, the situation erupted as prisoners began arming themselves with makeshift weapons that they used to take about 50 guards and civilian personnel hostage. In general, most of these hostages would not be harmed, and would even be protected by the very prisoners who were taking them hostage. That being said, 5 of the men captured were badly beaten. This included one guard who was struck hard in the head by his own nightstick after he refused to give it up. Following these initial assaults, though, all the hostages were taken to the center of the yard, where the Black Muslim prisoners formed a protective circle around them, keeping them safe while other prisoners gave the hostages blankets to keep them warm from the chill November air. The rebellious Auburn inmates then created a list of 12 demands, which included demands for better food, better clothing, better medical care and treatment, improved sanitary conditions, and more Spanish-speaking correction officers and counselors. They also wanted more courses on black culture, improvements in the law library, and finally they wanted protections from reprisals for their actions that day. There would then be a 6-hour standoff between the prisoners and the prison officials. That finally came to an end when the prison officials promised that if the prisoners released their hostages and surrendered peacefully, there would be no reprisals, and afterward they would have the opportunity to sit down with correction officials to discuss their demands. The prisoners then held up their end of the bargain, releasing the hostages and surrendering peacefully. Yet, instead of following through with their promises, the officials allowed the prisoners to be beaten and forced to run a gauntlet of angry guards armed with batons. After which, 120 prisoners were taken to the prison's special housing unit, where they were put into solitary confinement indefinitely. Additionally, 6 of these prisoners would eventually face criminal indictments. Now, everything I've just detailed are clear and obvious examples of the kinds of reprisals the prisoners had feared and had been assured they wouldn't suffer if they surrendered peacefully. The news of this response and the fact that the prisoners had been lied to, beaten, and punished with solitary confinement would have lasting impacts on our story, as the news of these events got out, spreading to the other New York State prisons like Attica in particular. Before we move on to the main thrust of our narrative, the events in Attica, I want to first take the time to discuss one of the main causes why these prison uprisings were taking place. A lot of the inmates' unrest had to do with the terrible and unsanitary conditions they were forced to live in, a big reason for which was overcrowding. All of a sudden, you see, the prisons in New York State and all across the United States were being filled with more prisoners than they had ever been designed for. This explosion in prison population helped to make the conditions inside the prisons unsanitary, and also meant that their budgets couldn't provide for the basic needs for their prisoners. As such, the food was of extremely poor quality, and oftentimes insufficient to meet the basic dietary needs of the inmates. This was all a consequence of America's new war on crime, as I've mentioned several times already. Now, one of the main impelling forces behind this so-called war were the angry riots that rocked northern cities in the 1960s. More than riots, though, these events might be better characterized as urban rebellions, as they were time and again in reaction to discrimination, police brutality, and the lack of jobs and opportunity for African Americans and other minorities. Blacks in northern states, you see, were just as fed up with the system and the lot in life they had been given just because of the color of their skin as their southern cousins were. As just because Jim Crow was more overt in its oppression did not mean that northern cities were any less racist or oppressive in practice. These uprisings, though, deeply unnerved northern whites and their politicians. This included even those who had been broadly supportive of the civil rights protesters and their attempts to overturn the system of Jim Crow. This support, though, seems to have been at least in part contingent on the fact that this unrest wasn't happening in their own backyards. Now that it was, though, they quickly moved to characterize the people in the streets not as individuals with valid grievances, people who were fed up with oppressive systems and racism, but instead they suddenly became criminals bent on destruction and nothing else. The first of these urban uprisings had its roots in the events of the 16th of July 1964. On that day, a 15-year-old black student named James Powell and some of his classmates waited across the street from their school for their summer school classes to start, at which point a white building superintendent turned a hose on them as he reportedly did not want these black kids hanging out in front of his building. Outraged, several of these students, including Powell, then chased a man into his apartment. It was at this point that an off-duty, out-of-uniform white police lieutenant named Thomas Gilligan involved himself in the situation, confronting the black students who may or may not have been pounding on the apartment door. As he was doing this, Gilligan claimed that Powell lunged at him with a knife, forcing the out-of-uniform, off-duty cop to shoot the 15-year-old boy 3 times, killing him. Yet while Gilligan claimed the shooting of 15-year-old James Powell was justified, the people of Harlem weren't buying it. There were questions of whether or not the 15-year-old had a knife, as well as questions of even if he did, was there not some better way to handle the situation other than deadly force? It didn't take long for the anger at this situation to begin boiling over, as just 2 days after Powell was killed, a previously unplanned civil rights demonstration turned into a march on the Harlem State House as people looked for answers about Powell's death. This march was only the beginning, as the following 6 nights saw a combination of protests and violence that shook the city, as thousands took to the streets with some looting stores and others throwing bottles and rocks at the cops. Now, the thing that makes these events especially important, in addition to being yet another example of cops using excessive force when dealing with people in general, and black men and boys in particular, was the fact that even as Powell was dying in the street in New York City, on the other side of the country in San Francisco, Barry Goldwater was accepting the Republican nomination for president. Goldwater was leading a conservative takeover of the party and was basing a fair amount of his campaign on so-called law and order issues, with statements like, quote, "Security from domestic violence no less than from foreign aggression is the most elementary and fundamental purpose of any government." Now, of course, this was about more than just crime, as the Goldwater campaign was very much based in a backlash against the prospect of racial equality, as illustrated by the conservative journal The National Review, writing things like, quote, "What is happening or is about to happen, let us face it, is a race war." This fear of racial equality was then cloaked in concern about crime, as especially in the light of the events of the Harlem Uprising, crime in New York City seemed to be bad. The thing was, even if New York City's situation seemed bad, the reality was that in general, the national crime rate wasn't particularly notable, making the need for a crusade against crime questionable. Especially if you were to ask the black residents of New York City, who were, more often than not, those who were most impacted by any crime surge that existed, as they would be the first ones to tell you that the greater problem at hand wasn't crime, but stuff like poor housing, poor schools, and poverty in general, all of which were at least partially the result of discrimination, as African Americans were blocked from getting good jobs, even as the decline in the industrial economy ensured that what jobs they could get were insufficient. Further adding fuel to this dangerous situation was the way that these communities were neglected by both the press and the police, who notably had no African Americans on their staff. Then, even when the police did get involved, they were typically equal parts corrupt and unnecessarily brutal. Indeed, the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, had around this time just passed the nation's first stop and frisk law. It was then these factors that were responsible for the situation in Harlem and elsewhere, as some turned to crime, while others with no hope, when pushed too far, lashed out sometimes violently. In other words, these same conditions that led to crime also led to the unrest that would spark uprisings in multiple northern cities. Notably, these rage-filled destructive episodes seem to reflect badly on the man who was president at the time, Goldwater's opponent LBJ. Indeed, Goldwater would blame the unrest happening in northern cities not on the factors previously discussed, but on black leaders and their liberal allies like LBJ, who, according to Goldwater, through their campaigns of civil disobedience, had weakened the respect for quote-unquote legitimate authority. In response to try and counter Goldwater, LBJ recast his war on poverty as a war on crime, which could have been fine if he simply cast policies designed to better people's lives as ones that would ultimately have the effect of cutting down on crime and social unrest. Instead, even after easily defeating Goldwater, LBJ would sign off on the creation of the Office of Law Enforcement Assistance that provided money to local and state police for things like training and equipment. This new office funded the purchase of patrol cars, radios, infrared cameras, riot gear, and helicopters. This was then followed up by the passage of the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, which served to funnel even more federal dollars into state and local police departments. In doing so, LBJ and the others who supported these acts more or less ended the New Deal era, as instead of using social welfare programs and the like to address social and economic marginalization, the state's primary means of dealing with these issues became policing through more punitive laws and more aggressive policing. All of this had been done in a foolhardy attempt to blunt the rising conservative opposition, yet by embracing their logic they seemingly only fed this movement, which ultimately led to Nixon winning the next election, with declarations like, quote, "The first civil right of all Americans is to be free from domestic violence." Nixon then further expanded the war on crime with the war on drugs, which was itself designed to crush Nixon's political opponents, including African Americans. So, with the country's wealth being diverted away from programs meant to help the poor and downtrodden, and instead being funneled into police departments, the nation's prisons began filling at an alarming rate. Instead of trying to curb unrest by improving people's lives, the state had dedicated itself to suppressing unrest through force. More people than ever were being sent to prison, and then when some of these individuals rebelled in response to the terrible conditions they found themselves in, the state again responded with force, the results of which would prove to be deadly. We now come to the main location of our story today, Attica Prison, which was itself located in the town of Attica, a town that sits in the middle of the rolling farmland of Wyoming County, New York, a little ways east of Lake Erie. Now, you'll be surprised to learn that much like the New York City jails that saw a series of rebellions in 1970, in the lead-up to Attica's 1971 uprising, it was also becoming increasingly crowded, as it became the home to some 2,243 prisoners, the majority of whom were young African Americans or Puerto Ricans. Yet, despite having a significantly large Puerto Rican population, many of whom could only speak Spanish, there really was no one on staff to act as a translator for these prisoners. In fact, there was only one corrections officer who could speak Spanish, but his fellow guards insisted that he should never speak with the prisoners in Spanish. Now, Attica was a maximum security prison, so it seemingly makes sense that 2/3 of its prisoners had been incarcerated at least one time before, which certainly makes it sound like the individuals in prison here were some real tough cases. These were repeat offenders, hardened criminals, the worst of the worst. Now, surely there were some here and there that might have fit that description, yet still more than a few of Attica's prisoners were just young kids who had made a mistake. Indeed, a number of these prisoners were there just because they had violated the parole in stupid and silly ways. Take, for example, 21-year-old Elliot Barkley, who had gotten sent to Attica for the terrible crime of violating his parole by driving without a license. There was also Angel Martinez, a Puerto Rican kid who suffered from the effects of polio. To try and deal with the pain, Angel started taking heroin, which he quickly got addicted to and was subsequently jailed after committing a crime to feed his habit. Also thrown into this maximum security prison were hardened criminals like 19-year-old twins James and John Schleich. John, you see, had originally been arrested for, quote, unauthorized use of a motor vehicle.